In anticipation of his latest project, Tenet, I sat down and watched Christopher Nolan's previous film, Dunkirk, which for some reason I never got around to watching. Nolan's films are always worth watching. He's an excellent director, even if his fan base can be quite rabid. Dunkirk, of course, tells the tale of the legendary evacuation proceedings during a particularly fierce battle in World War II, in which Allied forces found themselves trapped by the German army. On paper, the events were a crushing defeat for the British, but it was considered something of a moral victory, something that would spur on the Allied troops and British citizens for future victories in the war, and the events at Dunkirk are considered to be some of the most important of the entire saga. Nolan makes the interesting decision of telling the story of the evacuation from the viewpoint of three different people in slightly out of sync time periods that occasionally overlap. You have an infantry soldier among thousands simply looking for a way off the beaches and back home. You have a Spitfire fighter pilot providing cover for the seafront evacuation and finding himself in quite a few dogfights as he tries to stop bombers taking out the Allied ships. And we also follow a civilian boat captained by a man and his son who risk their lives to travel across the English Channel to pick up evacuating soldiers. So you've got a story on land, sea and air. Because of this creative decision to focus on three very individual storylines to tell the greater story, we don't really get a proper sense of the scale of the chaos of Dunkirk. It's quite a subversion of the usual tropes of war movies, where you often see huge armies going at it, explosions and screaming everywhere. You don't even see any German soldiers in the film, not clearly at least, and it makes for quite interesting viewing just following three small-scale storylines in a large-scale story. Dunkirk has a very unsettling and tense atmosphere. Composer Hans Zimmer ditches his bomb momentarily and instead adopts a tense ticking soundtrack that never lets up until the end of the film. A sound that was actually extracted from Nolan's own watch. It feels quite uncomfortable watching the film. It isn't going for typical action entertainment. The sound design in the film is loud, relentlessly, and coupled with the music and the content of the film, which is essentially a collection of very tense scenes one after the other. And Dunkirk is almost oppressive. It's an assault on the senses. Sometimes you can't even tell what is part of the film's score, or whether it is the wailing sound of passing planes or the droning of distant gunfire. It feels like the film almost wants to hurt you. It never lets you get too comfortable, but it's really adept at reeling you in. I found myself tapping my feet to these scores ticking, and on one occasion when a character had the bad guy in his crosshairs, I had the urge to shout out at my screen for him to shoot the guy. In stark contrast to the film's abusive atmosphere, it is beautiful to look at. In typical Nolan fashion, there's little to no CGI, and the numerous authentic or replica ships, boats or planes are made full use of. There's some really compelling scenery shots, and some of the best moments of the film involve Tom Hardy flying around in his Spitfire. Even putting the excellent and movie-stealing dogfights to the side, just seeing the aircraft fly around sandwiched between the sky and the sea is a majestic sight. World War II buffs I'm sure will love the attention to detail. In fact, the film was actually screened to veterans of Dunkirk to positive reception. There isn't a lot of talking in the film. It's a nice change of pace because quite often I find people in Nolan's movies talk too much. There's too much exposition shat out of people's mouths. And even in Dunkirk, when people talk, they do tend to hammer home some of the film's points in case the audience is too dumb to figure out what's going on. But thankfully, there's not a whole load of it. And as a result, the film is much more of an experience. Because you kind of just sit and take it all in, all the visuals and sounds. And what with the movie being only around an hour and 45 minutes and thrusting us straight into the action, it feels like a quick, sharp and intense ride that's over in a flash. I felt that one of the primary themes of the film was self-preservation versus selfishness, and what kind of outcome it can have in the grand scheme of things. Many a time in the film, characters face situations where they could escape with their lives intact, but it would likely have much graver repercussions. Likewise, they could choose to make a decision for the greater good, but chances are it wouldn't be so good for them. There's quite a few internal battles that occur in the film, characters wrestling with themselves in the heat of the moment, having to make split-second choices that could result in their doom, or the doom for thousands. And I think that element of the film really swallows up the entire movie, and produces the ending where essentially we're told that the entire thing was a was technically a defeat for the Allies, but in a way was considered one of the war's greatest victories. And we can understand that, because we were on the inside looking out. We saw how, regardless of how bad things ended up, they could have been a lot worse if not for the courage of a few individuals. People going into Dunkirk should know that it is different. It's very low on characterization and narrative, but heavy on spectacle. Some might feel the lack of a protagonist means the movie lacks emotional firepower, and I agree to an extent, because there isn't really any opportunity to grow attached to the characters. And instead of the spectacle being a vehicle for character growth, the characters are a vehicle for the spectacle. I found Dunkirk excellent on a technical level, and moderate as a piece of entertainment. I give it a 7 out of 10.